Hello, fellow adventurers, and welcome back to another episode of Word Safari. This episode is going to be a little bit of a sequel of what we were talking about last time. You might recall that our last episode was about a specific Indo-European route that had to do with brightness and therefore the sky and also the gods. You might recall that we said that in ancient Indo-European cultures, such as the Greeks and the Romans, and really many others that lived around the Mediterranean, whether they were Indo-European or not, the sky was thought of as the home of the gods, and it was literally their physical residence. Most cultures actually believed that the gods physically resided up in the sky in some way, shape, or form. I also mentioned that most of these cultures didn't have separate words for what we would today call sky, heaven, and space or outer space. These are three separate things that we think of today with three separate words, but most ancient cultures did not have separate words for any of those things. Let's dive in. The first thing I want to do is start with some native English words and see how we even kind of got this modern separation in the first place. If we sort of trace our native English vocabulary here before we start talking about the ancient world and how they talked about it, some of this will make a little bit more sense. So let's start with our modern English word heaven. Now, for the most part, when we say the word heaven today in modern English, it's kind of a religious idea. It's maybe where you go or your soul goes when you die, and it may not even be a physical place in this universe. It may be a spiritual place. In other words, no matter how far you drive out into space in the spaceship, you'll never find heaven, right? But that's not necessarily what this word originally meant. It actually comes from an Old English word, haelvon, and that F would have been pronounced like a V. So it's basically the same word, even though the spelling looks a little bit different. And that Old English word, haelvon, would have come from a Proto-Germanic word that was either heaving or hemine. We think hemine is actually the older form, and that there was dissimilation. The M and the N are very similar, and so the M probably became a B or a V sound, and that's where we get heaven from, with the B, V, F sound there in the middle, even though there are other Germanic languages like modern German where that dissimilation did not happen, and it's still an M there for the modern word for heaven in German. This probably comes from the Indo-European root kem, which means to cover, and so the original meaning of the word heaven was probably just a covering. In other words, it wasn't this spiritual idea of an afterlife. It was literally the covering that you see up there when you look up from the earth that you are standing on. So that's all heaven would have originally meant. It would have just been the covering of the earth. It's what you see when you look up. And that would have been the normal word that our linguistic ancestors used 1,500 years ago, let's say, to refer to anything you see when you look up: sky, heaven, outer space, which they didn't necessarily know about yet, at least not in the way we do today, and maybe also where the gods live. All of those words would have been heaven in the oldest English that we have record of. The word sky did not exist yet. That actually came into the English vocabulary a little bit later. It came as a result of the Viking or Norse invasions of England, and the English language took a lot of vocab words, a lot of borrowings from the Norse language. Now, the Norse language is also a Germanic language. It's a different branch of the Germanic family, but it's pretty closely related to English because it is part of the same subgroup of Indo-European. Now, in Old Norse, the word ski was just a word that meant cloud. It was clouds. That's how you would refer to them. And then once this word got borrowed into English, and we pronounce it sky today, of course, it would have been ski originally in like Middle English before the Great Vowel Shift. It came to mean not just clouds, but the area where the clouds exist, the area where the clouds reside. And so now, for the first time, English had two different words for two different parts of what you see when you look up. The sky would have been the first thing you see, the lower part, and maybe that's where the clouds are. And if you live in Northern Europe, you know it's a pretty cloudy place, so there's clouds up there quite a bit if you look up. And then heaven might be what's beyond that. That would be what we might today call outer space, or what we might today call heaven in more of a spiritual sense of where the gods live, or maybe where you go in the afterlife. So it wasn't until what we would call the Middle Ages that you got a distinguishing of these things in the English language. Before that, there was really only one word. It was heaven for all of that stuff up there. And by the way, as you can see, sky is cognate with our native English word shadow. So the original Norse word that meant cloud it just means something that shadows the earth or casts a shadow onto the earth, which obviously makes a lot of sense because that's what clouds do, right? Okay, so we can see how in the English language in the past 1,500 years, things things have evolved where we can now talk about these separate things with different words, but archaically that wasn't the case. Now, if we go to Latin and Greek, which were the predominant languages of the ancient Mediterranean, we will see that they did not have this distinction at all. They used the same word for what we would today call sky, heaven, space. All of those things would have been under one word each in each language. And in Latin, that word was caelum. Now, again, yes, they had words for clouds and things like that, but caelum could be anything that was above you: sky, heaven, heavens, which is one case in modern English where if we put it in the plural, we might actually mean the sky or outer space in some way and not the spiritual idea of heaven if you pluralize it. So sky, heaven, heavens, outer space, all of that could have been caelum in Latin. We get words like celestial from caelum. If we talk about celestial bodies, they're things that are up there, right? And that comes from the Latin adjective caelestis, which does come from that Latin noun caelum. The Romance languages get their normal words for both sky and heaven from caelum, so Spanish cielo, French ciel, and we actually have a borrowing directly from French into English that comes from that French word that comes from Latin caelum, and that is ceiling. Now, obviously, the ceiling is not the sky or heaven, but you can see how something that's above you in a house, like a roof, would get a term that means something that is from above, right? In Greek, that word was uranos. Uranos is how this would have been pronounced in archaic or classical Greek. This was also the name of the god Uranos. If you know about this god, if you know about Greek mythology, he was the original father of the gods. He's the sky god. He is literally the sky god personified. That's what his name is. When the Romans borrowed it, they borrowed it as Uranus, which is very similar to Uranos. They spelled it a little bit differently, as you can see, and then that has been anglicized as Uranus, or sometimes Uranus, and of course that is where we have gotten the name of the planet from, as well as the element uranium that comes from the name of that planet, actually. So, as you can see, in both Latin and Greek, they had one word that meant the sky, heaven, the heavens, outer space, where the gods live. All of those things were kind of crammed into one term because that's sort of what they saw when they looked up. So for the rest of this safari, we're going to be talking about other words that are that pertain to things that we humans of any age see when we look up. We're going to see that a lot of these things were named from ancient Latin and Greek based on what they thought they saw. They're just looking at things when they look up. They don't have the benefit of modern science or modern telescopes, but they have their eyes, they have their minds, and they have their vocabulary. So let's see some of the words that they came up with. Now, of course, star is a very basic thing, a very basic word that pertains to something that you might see when you look up. Now, we actually talked about this in a previous safari, so this is a little bit of a review. It comes from the Old English stera, which comes from the Indo-European root ster, and the Greek word that means star is aster, which is the same word with an a on the front, and the Latin word that means star is stella, which was originally sterla, and then there was assimilation of the R to the L, which is why you get two L's there. Either way, all three of these words in Old English, Greek, and Latin all come from this Indo-European root ster. This is probably the least interesting one, and it's still pretty interesting because you can see the connections between these three languages once you see them. Let's go on to another word that would define or describe something that the ancients would have seen when they looked up. Now, again, most of the things that you see when you look up into the night sky are stars. You see a lot of stars, and even though they didn't have telescopes, even with the naked eye, they could see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of stars when they looked up. However, many ancient cultures around the Mediterranean, such as the Egyptians, such as the Babylonians, and ultimately the Greeks and the Romans as well, had been staring at the stars for a long time. In other words, they kind of made a science out of this. They didn't have a separate idea of astronomy versus astrology back then. They kind of combined that all into just the study of the stars, essentially. And so they would look up and they would pay attention to the stars, and they would make very good records of what those stars were doing. Now, they noticed very quickly that even though most stars follow a fixed path throughout the sky, which now we know is due to the Earth's rotation, not due to the star's movements, but they didn't know that. Either way, most stars follow a fixed path throughout the sky. They go in a fixed path every day, depending on the seasons, depending on where you are on Earth and everything, but it's still a fixed path, right? However, they noticed that there were a few stars, just a handful of stars, or things that look like stars at least, that did not follow those fixed paths. Instead, they seem to wander. They seem to just go on their own little merry ways all about the night sky. And the ancients weren't really sure why this was, but they knew it happened. They could definitely describe it. And they had a word for these things. These things were planetes. That's actually the singular in Greek, although it kind of looks plural to us. A planetes is a wanderer. It comes from the Greek verb planao, which means to wander. Like if you're on the road and you take a detour off the road, you are a planetes. You are a wanderer. You're wandering off of the path. So there was this small group of stars, or at least what they thought were stars, what looked like stars to them, that would take these weird wandering paths throughout the sky, and they just described them with the vocabulary they had. They said, okay, those are wandering stars, or they are the wanderers, and they called them planetae. That's actually the plural in Greek. And of course, we get our word planet from this today, but planet didn't mean planet in the ancient Greco-Roman vocabulary. It actually meant wanderer, because they didn't know that those things that were wandering throughout the sky were actually planets just like Earth. That was a later development of the word. They would have not called Earth a planet because they were living on it. Planets were the wandering stars that they saw up through the sky. Now, interestingly, they called some things planets that we would not call planets, and on the other hand, they did not call some things planets that we would call planets. Now, the latter one's easy. It's because they didn't have telescopes, and so there were some planets they had not discovered yet. So, for instance, anything past Saturn, so Uranus, Neptune, maybe Pluto. That's controversial, right? Any of those they wouldn't have called planets because they didn't know about them. Although if they could have seen them, they would have called them planets. But there were some other things that they saw up in the night sky that took their own courses that were not like regular stars that they did call planets. So they actually had a canon, an official list of 7 planets in antiquity. And this really goes for all cultures all over the earth that could look up at the night sky or the sky period and see these 7 things with the naked eye. The first 2 of them are going to be things that we would not call planets today. And that is the sun and the moon, because the sun and the moon follow their own courses and they're not like regular stars. The other 5 you are going to recognize: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and of course, last but not least, Saturn. These were the 5 planets that we would agree on with the ancients that they would call planets, and we would also call planets, even though they would call them planets for a different reason. In other words, they didn't know what these things were. They just knew that they were things that looked like stars that were taking their own sort of weird paths throughout the sky. Why did they call the sun and the moon planets? Well, again, they are things that you can see up in the night sky that do not act like stars. They do their own thing in some way, shape, or form. Even if you can describe them, if you watch them long enough, they're not regular stars, as we all know today. So there was this kind of canonical list of 7 planets in antiquity. Now, this actually is important for some other reasons. The fact that there are 7 planets connects to some other things in our life that are still going on today, and I'm not talking about astrological things or anything like that. So this is going to be another episode that we're going to have to do in the future. So sort of put a little bookmark here in your head, because we will come back to this idea of the 7 planets of antiquity. But for now, let's keep going and let's look at some other words for things that you might see in the night sky that have terms that come from ancient Greek or Latin that are just sort of named after what they look like, kind of like planets were named after what they looked like. They looked like they were wandering all over the place. It wasn't really a descriptive term for what they were. It really said more about what they looked like to people in antiquity. Asteroid comes from a Greek word asteroides, which is made up of 2 parts. The aster part is what we already saw, which is star. The eides part actually has come up in a previous safari as well, because it means appearing like. So when you put those 2 things together, what is an asteroid? It's just an object that looks like a star, but maybe isn't. So if you look at it for a while, you might think it's a star, but then if you look back, it won't necessarily be acting like a star. We know today that asteroids are, rocks, basically. They didn't know that. They just knew it was something that looked like a star, but wasn't. Comet is in a similar vein, but maybe even more interesting than asteroid. Comet comes from the Greek word kometes, and this comes from the Greek noun kome, which is hair. It's just hair. It's one of the regular words for hair in the ancient Greek language. And you can probably guess why they would have called a comet a hair item, because it's got this trail going along behind it, like it's got long flowing hair that's behind it, long luscious luscious locks that are flowing in the wind as it's going wherever it's going. That was what they saw. When they looked up and saw a comet, they said, huh, it's a star with hair. So we're going to call it a hairy star, basically, which does not sound as cool as comet, but that is, in fact, where the word comet comes from. What else would they have seen when they looked up? They would have seen galaxies. This is another instance of something that they didn't know what it was from a modern scientific perspective, but they could still see it. They could see what it looked like, and they could name it something. So galaxy comes from the Greek word galaxia, so it hasn't changed very much. And that comes from the Greek word galak, which just means milk. It was one of their regular words, essentially, for milk. So all a galaxy is, etymologically speaking, is a milky looking part of the sky. Today, of course, sometimes we call the Milky Way our galaxy, right? Because it looks milky. So again, doesn't really tell you what it is, just kind of tells you what it looks like from an ancient perspective. And if you know ancient mythological stories, different cultures had different mythologies about why there's a bunch of milk up there in the heavens. Greek mythology has a particularly interesting story about the origin of the galaxy par excellence. What about a nebula? Nebula is another word that really just refers to what something looks like. It comes from the Latin word nebula, which just means cloud or mist or fog. It's connected to their regular word for cloud. A cognate we have in English, like a regular word, is nebulous. If something is nebulous, it's kind of foggy. You're not really sure about it. It might be right, it might be wrong. You don't really know. It's undefined. That's what it means for something to be nebulous, and it is connected with the Latin word nebula. So all a nebula is, from this Latin word that meant cloud or mist or fog or something like that, it's just something that you look up at the night sky and it looks like a cloud or it looks like a mist. Once again, they did not know what it was. They didn't really know why it looked like a cloud or a mist, but they could tell, yep, that looks like a cloud or a mist. So we're going to call it a nebula, which makes sense. Constellation is another word that comes from a Latin root. The Latin word is constellatio, which just meant a collection of stars. This is made up of two different parts in the original Latin, both of which you probably are familiar with by now if you've been watching these safaris. Con means together or with, just like it still does in Spanish today. Stella, which we have already talked about in the safari, means star. So when you put con and stella together, it's a bunch of stars together. I mean, that's really all a constellation is. This is another thing we could probably do another safari on at some point, because as you probably know, a lot of the constellations have names that are keyed or connected to ancient Greek mythology, especially. So different cultures had different names for some of these constellations or collections of stars, and they connected them to their stories and to their cultures, which is pretty cool. Okay, so those are some things that we have in the night sky, and we may know what they are better than the people in the ancient Mediterranean world did, but we still use their names, and their names betray something about how they saw those things. For the last few things that we're going to look at in the safari, let's fast forward 15, 16, 17, 1800 years from the period of the Roman Empire and talk about some words that we have coined more recently for things that we may see when we look up, sometimes because we've just discovered them, we've come to understand them, but nonetheless, these are going to be words that do have their roots etymologically in ancient Greek and Roman vocabulary, so they're still cool to look at. Again, in the ancient world, when they looked up, they didn't know about outer space. That was not really a concept that they had, because they looked up, they saw what they saw the stars, they saw the sun, they saw the moon, they saw all the other things that we have just been looking at, comets and asteroids and nebulas and everything else, but they didn't necessarily know that there was such a vast amount of space up there, although different philosophers always had different theories. So the idea of space or outer space is a pretty recent idea. It's something that we have figured out fairly recently, but the word space does come from a Latin word. That Latin word was spatium. Spatium could be a room or an area or a span of time. So they could use this word to mean a span of space, like a room or an area, or a span of time, like a minute or an hour, or a moment maybe would be a good translation of this word if it is referring to a span of time. Now, they didn't know about space-time. Einstein had not come along yet, but nonetheless, they knew that space and time could be measured with the same word, spatium, even if they did not realize that these were two dimensions of the same fabric of space-time, as we have realized very recently in the history of the human species. Now, if you're wondering why we say space instead of spate, In other words, why do we have a C instead of a T there? That's French's fault. It came through Old French, which had espace, which palatalized that T to a C, added an E, but then we took it off again. So we don't say a space, we say space. And of course, we use this etymologically, basically in the way that the Romans used it. It's a big empty area. It's a room. It's an area, whatever. But we just use it as the empty area between all the denser objects that we know are up there when we look up. What about atmosphere? Now, the ancient Greeks and Romans and their scientists and their philosophers definitely knew that there was something. Like when you just put your hand out and grab air, that is something. There is something there. And they had different theories for what this something was. Many of them believed in a substance called the ether, which comes from an ancient Greek word aether, which means burning. It's like the place that the light goes through. That's why they would have called air the burning stuff or whatever. And those theories persisted all the way through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance until fairly recently. More recently, we have coined this word atmosphere for what we are living in and what we are breathing in, this air that is all around us that goes up from the earth. We have recently called this the atmosphere. So even though this is a newer term, it does come from two Greek words that would have been normal words in ancient Greek, atmos, which was vapor, and spira, which of course is just sphere, and we get our regular word sphere from this, okay? So the atmosphere is the sphere of air or vapor or all of these things that surround a planet. That's the sphere part. It surrounds a planet in a circle. So it's a sphere of air vapor, water vapor, or whatever it is that surrounds a planet. Now, you probably know that we have identified 5 levels of the Earth's atmosphere. And again, they didn't know about this at all 2,000 years ago. But we have used mostly Greek and a little bit of Latin to name these things, so they are worth talking about from an ancient Greek and Latin perspective. The lowest level of the atmosphere, the one that we are all living in and obviously spend the vast majority of our lives in, is the troposphere. The troposphere comes from the Greek word tropo, which means a turn or a turning. There were verbs you could make from this. There were nouns that you could make from this. So the troposphere is literally the sphere in which air and water vapor turn about. The troposphere is where all the weather happens. When you look up and see the clouds, they're going to be somewhere in the troposphere, whether higher or lower in the troposphere. And that's basically why it got the name troposphere. It's where everything happens, basically, when it comes to the weather. Above the troposphere is the stratosphere. This actually comes from the Latin word stratus, which means spread out, as in into a layer. We talk about strata in the rocks in geology. This is the same word, a layer of something. So the stratosphere is literally the sphere of layers. There are different layers to it, and that's essentially why it got named the stratosphere. Above the stratosphere is the mesosphere. This comes from the Greek root meso, which just means middle. So this one's not very creative. It's the middle sphere. It's the middle 3 of the 5, and so they called it the mesosphere. Above the mesosphere is the thermosphere. You may know from some other words like thermometer that thermo comes from the ancient Greek root thermo, which means heat. So the thermosphere is the hot sphere. This is where the temperatures can get very hot due to the sun's radiation hitting it and things like that. And finally, at the end of the atmosphere, if you keep going up, is the exosphere. This one is also not very creatively named. It comes from Greek exo, which just means out or outside. So the exosphere is the outer sphere. It's the last one you get to of the 5. So you can see that even though we have discovered and named these layers of the atmosphere pretty recently in human history, the people who named them went back to Greek and Latin and got terms from Greek and Latin to name them, which is pretty cool. Finally, I think that we would all be disappointed if I didn't end this with one particular word that we today associate with space and with things that are out there, whether planets or something else. And that is, of course, the term alien. But even the term alien just comes from a normal word back in Latin. The term alien comes from the Latin word alienus, which means belonging to another. It could be belonging to another person, like you're in a foreign land, so you're an alien. And of course, we still use that word in that way today if you were an alien in a foreign land, right? It could be belonging to another person, like this object is alien to me. It's not mine. So we still use the word alien in some ways that were more like how the the ancient Romans would have used this word. But really today, space aliens, which you used to have to say space aliens, now you just say aliens, and people usually think you mean space aliens, right? So this word has kind of come to mean space alien, even though that was not necessarily the original term at all. But you can see why we would have used the word alien to refer to these hypothetical beings that come from outer space. They belong to another place, and so it's actually a pretty good word to describe them. Now, we do have a lot of cognates from this same root in Latin. That's al, which means other. If you have an alias, which just comes straight from a Latin word, it means you have another identity. If you have an alibi, you have a story that puts you in another place at a specific time. And if you alter something, then you are changing it into another form. And I could really go on because we actually have a lot of things that come from this Indo-European root all ultimately, but there are three really easy ones that you can see: alias, alibi, and alter, that all connect to alien. Okay, that's going to end our safari for today. We've gone through a lot of things that you can see when you look up into outer space or into the celestial realms. If you have anything else you're curious about, let me know, and I will see you next time.